Hi, I'm Mark Davidson, and this is the Four Signposts. In this five-part teaching, we will learn what the exhortation in Revelation 18:4 truly means. That exhortation says, "Come out of her, my people." And if you are a Christian, this message is for you. It doesn't matter whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Pentecostal, or non-denominational. This message is for you. And you will see that this is an extremely important message that you cannot miss. Now, here in the signpost, the Four Signpost Ministry, we show that much prophecy teaching today is wrong. Now, teaching about Israel and the second coming of Christ is, of course, correct. But because we get so much other prophecy scripture wrong, that we don't see that the Bible actually talks about what's going on in all the nations. All the activities in the last 20, 30, 40 years with Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey is actually prophesied about in the Bible. It reads like a script, but we miss it. And the reason we miss it is because God said in Daniel 12:4 that the words of that book are sealed until the end time. So we cannot understand it until now. But you see, so much prophecy teaching is based on guesses that were made by church fathers 18 centuries ago. Now, you can't blame them because they were making guesses. They thought they were in the end time. But as the centuries went by, instead of the church checking their guesses, they just simply built on them. So now, some of you may be aware of the chaos and big changes coming to our world shortly in these end times, starting with the Second Signpost. And the Second Signpost, of course, is Iran's great invasion of the Middle East. Iran will occupy many Muslim countries in the Middle East and will rewrite the political boundaries and will turn off the oil spigot, causing much chaos and hardship in the world. And that is Iran's great invasion of the Middle East. Anyway, I write about it in my book, Daniel Revisited, Discovering the Four Mideast Signs Leading to the Antichrist. The first sign occurred back in 2003, believe it or not. It involves Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Revelation 6, the four horsemen. It's for sale on all online bookstores. It is a Bible study and a history study showing that Bible actually talks about all these things. Likewise, in Iran's Great Invasion, I write a short story, about an hour's read, about the Second Signpost coming up. And finally, I write about the current events going on in the Middle East on my blog at www.foursignposts.com. But for now, and these will be topics of other videos, but for now, we are looking at why the come out of her warning is a warning that Christians cannot ignore. And this comes from a teaching of my last book, Hidden Babylon and God's Last Warning. Now, people have asked me, how can we prepare for all these hard times to come? You know, people talk about, should we store up gold, guns, groceries, the 3 Gs, but you should only do what God shows you to do. And it turns out that people, of course, make idols of these things, but God should be your God. These items, these supplies should not be your God. And you should take comfort from God, not comfort from these supplies. And in the end, supplies will run out. Then what do? By far, the best way to prepare that I have found is to do what God says to do in Revelation 18:4, and that is to come out of her. Well, what does this really mean? And we can't know of what it means unless we know who or what she really is. So in this 5-part video teaching series, we will learn what is undoubtedly her real identity, and then we can know what come out of her really means. So let's go ahead and dive in. In this part 1, we will look at a new view using scripture form, and I will introduce you to that topic, and we will look at what the identity of Babylon is proposed. In part 2, we look at how Scripture proves this. Now, one thing here is that a lot of teachers on Babylon the Great teach that Revelation 17 and 18 teach you everything, but they are not. Revelation 17 and 18 is only the summary of all the things the Bible teaches. In part 3, we look at the hallmark of Babylon the Great, and that is idolatry, the truths of idolatry in the human heart. In part 4, we see how it builds up to the whole way the world has been operating for the last 2,000 years. And it turns out that is because of cultural idolatry. It not only has affected our history, but it affects the end times, how the end times will play out across much of the world. And it's all right there in the Bible if you know what to look for. That finally leads us to part 5, Come Out of Her, My People, which is an urgent message for all Christians to prepare. So, in part 1, what is proposed is that Babylon the Great is the opposite of the bride. And that's all there is to it. It's a very simple concept. And that the spirit of Babylon is the opposite of the spirit of Christ. Babylon the Great is not a single city like Rome or New York City. It's not a single religion like the Catholic Church or Islam. It's not a false church or a false religion. It's not a country. It is indeed the whole world. And once you understand this, it opens our eyes to not only idolatry and that unsaved mankind is swimming in it, but that it helps clarify prophecy, end-time events, prophetic end-time events throughout much of the world in Revelation. And once we know the true identity of the harlot, we can better see now, we can understand what coming out of her really means and what we need to do. And how we get there is that the new identity of Babylon the Great is shown by looking at the form of Scripture, and I'll explain that shortly. Scripture form gives us a hint or a clue as to what several interpretations of Scripture might say and which one might be right. You know, a single passage might have 2, 3, 4, 5 interpretations, but the form points us in one direction. Scripture form is the flow of repeating words and phrases that echo back and forth in a passage or several passages and phrases, and it's in the text. It's not a Bible code. It's plainly in the text when you read it, and it gives us more meaning in the text. The two types of Scripture forms are called convergent and parallel, and I'll explain that next. A single passage is convergent when it has two word flows similar to each other, using similar words in a similar order in the same passage, but one flow starts from the start of the passage and the other flow starts from the end of the passage, and they come together and converge in the middle, giving us a central thought. And that is the benefit to watching for convergent form. It tells us the main thought of a passage. It tells us the main thought to keep in mind when we read that passage to give us better understanding. The parallel form is two passages, and they could be close together next to each other or far apart in the Bible from each other. They are parallel when each passage has a word flow similar to the other, using the similar words in similar order, both flowing from the start to the end in the same order. And the benefit is it shows us these two passages are related to each other. And it tells us that these two passages might be related to each other when we didn't think they were. So, text form is a powerful tool, especially when it comes to prophecy. Scripture form and Scripture words must be in agreement with each other. And the Bible in its entirety, it turns out, confirms that this new view of Babylon the Great is the right one. Now, if you're curious about learning more, this Scripture form is called chiastics, and it comes from the Greek letter chi, which is an X. And as you can see from this earlier chart, you see how the two lines kind of form the first half of an X. And so to find Babylon the Great's true identity, we start by using the parallel form. We start with the harlot, described in Revelation 17, verses 1 to 18, and compare it to the bride, described in Revelation 21:9 to chapter 22:5. We will see 15 what are called marker pairs. That's a pair of words or phrases in the two passages, and they are called markers. 15 of them. The first one is where John writes in chapter 17, verse 1, that one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came. And in chapter 21, verse 9, John begins that one saying, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls. That should be a clue right there that they might have something in common. The second marker goes on in chapter 17, verse 1, where the angel says, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. And in chapter 21, verse 9, the angel tells John, come here, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And that's why those two marker sets of words are in red, to show you their opposites. One's talking about the harlot, the other one's talking about the bride. The third marker pair. In chapter 17, verse 3, John says that the angel carried him away into the spirit, into a wilderness. And in chapter 21, verse 10, the third marker pair, John says, and he, the angel, carried me away in the spirit to a high mountain. Now, some people who teach that Babylon the Great is a physical entity on earth will say that, oh, it must be in the wilderness. But this is not the case. This is a comparison showing what the harlot is compared to the bride. The harlot is in the wilderness, in other words, a place of desolation. And that's her ultimate destiny, is desolation. While the bride is going to be on a high mountain. And in the Bible, as we know from Jeremiah 51:25, Daniel 2:35, Zechariah 6:1, and Revelation 17:9, empires are represented by mountains. And so it says, he carried me away in the spirit to a high mountain. In other words, the ultimate destiny of the bride is she will be a great civilization, a great empire. The fourth marker talks about the two figures. I saw a woman sitting in chapter 17, verse 3. In chapter 21, verse 10, John says he sees the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down. Now, in Revelation 21:2, we know the holy city is the bride. So we see the two figures, and they're down or sitting down or coming down. That's the theme. A woman sitting versus the holy city coming down. The fifth marker pair. In chapter 17, verse 4, it says, the woman, the harlot, was adorned with gold and precious stones. In chapter 21, verse 11, we see the bride. It says, her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. Therefore, here we see a contrast. The bride is herself brilliant because Christ makes her that way, versus the woman, the harlot, who has to pretend, who's a knockoff, having to wear gold and precious stones to be brilliant. In the sixth pair, we see on her forehead a name was written in chapter 17, verse 5. And the bride in chapter 21, verse 12, we see, and names were written on them, on the 12 gates. The seventh marker pair talks about in chapter 17, verse 6, the witnesses of Jesus. And in chapter 21:14, it talks about the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now, how can witnesses and apostles be the same? Well, because the apostles were the first witnesses of Jesus. The eighth marker pair. The angel tells John, I will tell you the mystery of the woman. And in chapter 21, verse 15, John says, the one, the angel who spoke with me. So these are both passages are talking about, at this point, the angel speaking with John. The ninth marker pair is all about numbers. In chapter 17, verse 9, it's the 7 heads or 7 mountains. And in chapter 21, verse 21, it's the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Notice, too, each number is mentioned twice. Marker number 10, marker pair number 10. Chapter 17, verse 12 talks about the 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. Versus chapter 21, verse 24, The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. So they're both talking about kings. The 11th pair talks about what the kings bring. In chapter 17, verse 13, they bring their power and authority. And in chapter 21, 26, they bring glory and honor. In the 12th marker pair, the Lamb is mentioned in both places, chapter 17, 14, and in chapter 21, verse 27. The 13th marker pair talks about the waters. Chapter 17, verse 15 says, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits. Verses chapter 22, verse 1, he showed me a river of the water of life. The train continues. In the 14th marker pair, with the 10 horns, will hate the harlot and will eat her flesh and burn her up. While chapter 22, verse 2 says the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So here again in red, we see opposites. Eating and burning is tearing down. Healing is building up. And the 15th marker pair, chapter 17, verse 18 says, the woman reigns over the kings of the earth, while the throne of God and the Lamb in chapter 22, verse 3 rule, and his bondservants will serve him. So we see two sets of rulers and two sets of servants. The kings serving the woman and the bondservants of God serving God. Moving on to the spirit of the harlot compared to spirit of Christ. Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 to 8 are going to be compared to Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21. 8 marker pairs. The first marker pair in chapter 17, verse 3 shows the main figure sitting on her mount. I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Chapter 19, verse 11, John writes, I saw a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and that would be Jesus Christ. So again, the two figures are sitting on their two mounts. The second marker pair talks about what they wear. Jesus in chapter 19, verse 13 is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, but in chapter 17, verse 4, the woman is clothed in purple and scarlet. In other words, a knockoff, just like she had to wear gold and costly stones in order to look brilliant, like the bride naturally is. And the third marker pair, each figure is holding a metal object. The harlot holds a gold cup. Faithful and True holds a rod of iron. In the fourth marker pair, the harlot, the cup is spoken of, described as full of abominations and unclean things. And in chapter 19, verse 15, Jesus is treading out the winepress, which contains all these vile things. The fifth marker pair, which is truly remarkable, is each figure has a name, their name, written on their body, and the name is given in all caps. So, for the harlot, on her forehead a name was written, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And Faithful and True, in chapter 19, verse 16, it says on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The sixth marker pair, chapter 17, verse 7, talks about the 10 horns of the beast, which are 10 kings. And in chapter 19, verse 19, we see the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled. The kings of the earth will contain the 10 horns, the 10 kings. So we see overlap between the two groups. The seventh marker pair, it says in chapter 17, verse 8, the beast goes to his destruction. Chapter 19, verse 20, we're given more information. We're shown that the beast is thrown alive into the lake of fire. And the eighth and last marker pair, chapter 17, verse 8, speaks of those who dwell on the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life. Verses chapter 19, verse 21, it says, and the rest were killed with the sword. The rest who accompanied the beast. And so the rest, of course, are made up of people in chapter 17, verse 8, whose names have not been written in the book of life. The conclusions of this are the harlot and the bride are related, and the harlot and Jesus Christ are related. We can tell by these two pairs of passages where the marker list is rather consistent, showing us they are related. So how are they related? Well, in my book, Hidden Babylon, I go into a little more logic, and I show that basically the harlot and the bride are opposites, and the harlot and Jesus Christ are opposites. Now, how could the harlot and the bride be opposites? Well, as it says in the first box there, all human beings are part of and live in either the bride or the harlot. There are no exceptions. If you are a saint, if you make Jesus Christ the basis of your life, if you've died to self and are living for him, and if he is your life, then you live in the bride and are part of the bride. But if you haven't done that, if you are still serving self, if you are still serving your idols, drawing comfort from them rather than God, then you live in the harlot. Human beings live in either the bride or the harlot. There are no exceptions. Old teachings of Babylon the Great show how, well, maybe I'm not part of Babylon the Great. Well, if you're not serving Christ, you are part of Babylon the Great. And likewise, all human beings either have the Spirit of Christ ruling in their hearts or the spirit of the harlot ruling in their hearts. If you're serving Christ, the Spirit of Christ rules your heart. If you're serving yourself and idols, the spirit of the harlot rules your heart. It's one or the other. There are no exceptions. So in conclusion, we see all people who make Christ the basis of their lives and are part of the bride live in the New Jerusalem, and all people who make anything else, like such as idols, the basis of their lives are part of the harlot and live in the great city. Therefore, even people calling themselves Christian who haven't truly committed to Christ can still be part of and live in the harlot. Hence, that's why that exhortation is addressed. Come out of her, my people. And these results of this teaching will show us. It'll open our eyes to idolatry, show us that idols are of every type and every place, and all sins, all crimes, all wars are due to a people's idolatry. It'll give us a greater understanding of Bible prophecy. We can see trends in Bible prophecy spoken of across the world. In fact, it's already started in the Orient. And that God will take away the idolatry of the cultures in order that tens of millions of people in each area of the world will become saved. It'll give us more clarity on the Antichrist wars and his empire. It'll give us more clarity on the trumpets and bowls. And finally, it'll show us this understanding of Babylon the Great will show us how we need to respond to the exhortation to come out of her, my people. So I hope you check out the next 4 parts of this teaching. And if you like this video, please click or hit the like button and subscribe button. Thank you very much.